1. Mary Elizabeth Wilson. Mary Elizabeth Wilson didn't look like a killer. In fact, she looked more like everyone's grandmother. Short, plump, always smiling, she was known in the quiet English village of Windy Nook as a cheerful, friendly widow. But by the time the authorities caught up to her in 1958, she had buried 4 husbands and was about to marry a 5th. And what the police uncovered would make her one of the most notorious women in British criminal history. Mary's first husband died in 1955. At the time, no one questioned it. He was an older man, and she'd cared for him through illness. But what no one noticed was how quickly she remarried, and how each new husband seemed to die faster than the last. Her second husband, John Knowles, died just 12 days after their wedding. The third, Oliver Leonard, survived a bit longer, but still only 3 weeks. And her fourth, Ernest Wilson, collapsed suddenly after she prepared his supper. That's when the suspicions finally began. Friends and neighbors had noticed Mary's morbid sense of humor. She often joked at funerals about getting a bulk discount from the undertaker. She'd reportedly tried to pawn furniture from her third husband's house before he was even buried. And when she announced she was engaged again, just weeks after husband number 4 died, local authorities decided enough was enough. Police ordered exhumations. When they analyzed the remains of her last 2 husbands, they found deadly levels of phosphorus, a chemical often found in rat poison. Mary was arrested and charged with murder. During the investigation, police also discovered that she had claimed funeral insurance on multiple husbands, receiving payments for each death. At her trial in Newcastle Crown Court, she smiled, laughed, and acted like it was all a misunderstanding. But the evidence was overwhelming. Witnesses, toxicology reports, and her own words sealed her fate. In 1958, Mary Elizabeth Wilson was convicted of murdering at least 2 of her husbands and was sentenced to death by hanging. But her age, 66 at the time, and the growing public discomfort around executing elderly women led to her sentence being commuted to life in prison. She became the last woman in the UK to receive a death sentence for poisoning. Mary spent the final years of her life in prison, reportedly still cracking jokes and showing little remorse. She died behind bars in 1962. The press had dubbed her the Merry Widow of Windy Nook, but behind the nickname was a calculated killer who masked murder with charm, and nearly got away with it. Number 2, Sarah Lloyd. In the spring of 1955, just months before Ruth Ellis would become the last woman executed in the United Kingdom, another case shocked the British public, one that was so brutal, so vicious, it nearly claimed that final, infamous title. The woman's name was Sarah Lloyd, and the crime she committed inside a modest English home still echoes with horror nearly 70 years later. Sarah was living in Northampton with 87-year-old Elizabeth Broomfield, a retired nurse who had taken her in as a lodger and companion. To the outside world, it seemed like a peaceful arrangement, an elderly woman sharing her home with someone in need. But behind closed doors, resentment had been building. Sarah, who was in her mid-40s, was struggling with mental illness, poverty, and an overwhelming sense of frustration. And one day, that pressure exploded into violence. On the morning of May 31, 1955, neighbors reported hearing a commotion from inside Elizabeth's home. What investigators later found was a scene of unimaginable cruelty. Sarah had attacked the elderly woman with a spade, bludgeoning her repeatedly over the head. Then, in a final act of calculated savagery, she poured a kettle of boiling water over her victim's face and chest. Elizabeth Broomfield died in agony, her body bearing the signs of both blunt force trauma and scalding burns. When police arrived, Sarah didn't run. In fact, she admitted to the crime almost immediately. But she didn't express remorse. She said Elizabeth had treated her poorly, that she was tired of being spoken down to, and that she just snapped. It was a chilling confession, made all the more disturbing by how calmly she delivered it. The trial was swift. Held that June, Sarah Lloyd was found guilty of murder. The judge had little choice. Under the law, there was only one sentence for her crime: death. She was formally sentenced to be hanged at Holloway Prison. But public sentiment was beginning to shift. Executing women, especially in cases involving mental instability, was becoming increasingly controversial in post-war Britain. Just weeks after her conviction, the Home Secretary issued a reprieve. Sarah's death sentence was officially commuted to life in prison. And although she escaped the hangman's noose, she would never walk free again. Sarah Lloyd faded into obscurity, serving her sentence quietly behind prison walls. She never gave interviews, never explained herself again. And while her case was soon overshadowed by the much-publicized execution of Ruth Ellis that same year, her story remains one of the most gruesome and least-known examples of female-on-female violence in modern British legal history. She was spared the rope, but the prison cell remained her final home. 3. Sharon Wiggins. In 1968, Sharon Wiggins was just 17 years old when she made a decision that would cost her the rest of her life. Alongside two older accomplices, she walked into a bank in Dauphin County, Pennsylvania, with a gun in her hand and a plan to commit armed robbery. But what began as a reckless act of teenage desperation would end in murder, a death sentence, and a lifetime spent behind concrete walls. The trio had hoped for a quick robbery, to be in and out before anyone could react. But things went wrong fast. During the holdup, a customer tried to intervene. One of Sharon's accomplices shot him, killing him instantly. The bank erupted into chaos. Witnesses dove for cover, employees hit silent alarms, and by the time the group fled, the police were already on their trail. The investigation was rapid. Surveillance descriptions and fingerprints led authorities to all three suspects within days. Sharon Wiggins was arrested shortly after, still wearing the same clothes from the robbery. She didn't deny being there. She didn't try to run. But under Pennsylvania law, her age wouldn't save her. Despite being a minor, Sharon was tried as an adult. In court, prosecutors painted her as a willing participant in a violent, premeditated crime. Her defense emphasized her youth, her troubled upbringing, and the fact that she hadn't pulled the trigger. But the jury didn't see shades of gray. In 1969, Sharon Wiggins was sentenced to death, making her the youngest woman ever placed on Pennsylvania's death row. She waited just 2 years. In 1971, a landmark decision by the Pennsylvania Supreme Court struck down the mandatory death penalty for minors. Sharon's sentence was commuted to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. She was moved to the State Correctional Institution at Muncie, where she would remain for the next 4 decades. Over time, Sharon's story began to change. She earned college degrees while incarcerated, mentored younger inmates, became a voice for rehabilitation, a symbol of someone who had transformed behind bars. But parole was never an option. Despite repeated petitions, her life sentence remained untouched. In March 2013, after more than 44 years in prison, Sharon Wiggins died of a heart attack in her cell. She was 62 years old. At the time of her death, she had served longer than any other incarcerated woman in the state of Pennsylvania. Her name never became a headline. Her case wasn't the subject of podcasts or documentaries. But she was a teenager who faced execution and instead lived her entire adult life behind bars. A stark reminder that sometimes the sentence doesn't end with the judge's gavel. It stretches on, year after year, until the very last breath. 4. Dorothy Williams. Dorothy Williams was not a name anyone in Chicago feared until the bodies began to surface. Between 1987 and 1989, 3 elderly women were found dead in their own homes. Each had been beaten, strangled, and robbed. At first, the crimes seemed unconnected. 3 isolated tragedies in a city already battling a rising tide of violence. But behind the scenes, detectives were building a pattern. And at the center of it was a woman few suspected. Dorothy Mae Williams. Her victims were all elderly, all vulnerable, and all killed in strikingly similar ways. The first was 79-year-old Rose Bratton, attacked in her apartment and left to die. Months later, 71-year-old Mary Harris was murdered, her body discovered with signs of blunt force trauma. Then came 88-year-old Lillian Benson. Her apartment showed no signs of forced entry, but her body told a different story. Investigators began comparing notes across precincts. The killer wasn't sloppy, but she wasn't invisible either. Witnesses reported seeing a middle-aged woman near at least one of the scenes. And when police ran fingerprints from Lillian Benson's ransacked apartment, one partial print led them to Dorothy Williams. She had a criminal history: petty theft, prostitution, minor assaults. But nothing like this. Dorothy was arrested in 1990. At first, she denied everything, but the evidence was stacking up. She had pawned jewelry belonging to at least 2 victims. Her fingerprints were in places they shouldn't have been. And under pressure, she made partial confessions, claiming the killings were robberies gone wrong. Her trial began in 1991. The prosecution presented a narrative of cold, calculated violence, how Dorothy targeted women who trusted her or who wouldn't fight back. They said she chose widows and seniors because they were easy marks. The defense tried to argue mental instability, childhood trauma, poverty. But the jury saw the truth behind the pattern. This wasn't about survival, it was predatory. Dorothy Williams was found guilty of all 3 murders and sentenced to death. She became one of the very few women on Illinois death row. But her story didn't end there. In 2003, facing mounting pressure over wrongful convictions and systemic flaws in the justice system, Illinois Governor George Ryan made a sweeping decision. He commuted the death sentences of every inmate on death row, 167 people in total. Dorothy's death sentence was changed to life without parole. She would never walk free, but she would never be executed. Today, Dorothy Williams remains incarcerated, living out her life behind bars. Her name is rarely mentioned, her crimes largely forgotten by the public. But for the families of her victims, and for those who tracked her down, she remains a symbol of the quiet danger that hides in plain sight. A woman who killed the vulnerable, escaped execution, and now fades into the shadows of a prison cell she will never leave. 5. Patricia Krenwinkel.
With one man that turned into one of the most disastrous, most horrendous, most abominable situations that could possibly come.
In the late 1960s, America was unraveling. Protests, assassinations, and war dominated the headlines. But nothing prepared the nation for the darkness that would be revealed in August 1969, when actress Sharon Tate and 6 others were brutally murdered in their own homes. And among the killers, one name would echo through courtrooms and parole boards for decades: Patricia Krenwinkel. At just 19 years old, Krenwinkel had fallen under the spell of Charles Manson, a failed musician turned cult leader who preached a twisted gospel of race war and apocalyptic delusion. To her family, she had vanished without explanation. But inside the Manson family, she became one of his most obedient followers, willing to kill and kill again in his name. On the night of August 8, 1969, Krenwinkel joined 3 other members of the cult and broke into the Los Angeles home of Sharon Tate. What happened inside was unthinkable. Sharon, 8 months pregnant, was stabbed repeatedly. Friends of hers were tied up, shot, bludgeoned, and slashed. The next night, Krenwinkel helped carry out the equally savage murder of supermarket executive Leno LaBianca and his wife Rosemary. She stabbed Rosemary over a dozen times, then used her blood to write messages on the walls. The investigation began with confusion. The brutality seemed random, but within months, thanks to a confession from fellow cult member Susan Atkins, the pieces fell into place. The LAPD raided the Spahn Ranch and arrested Manson and his followers. Patricia Krenwinkel had fled to Alabama but was captured shortly after. Her trial in 1970 was a media frenzy. Cameras captured her smiling, laughing, and carving an X into her forehead to match Manson. Prosecutors called her brainwashed, but also fully responsible. In 1971, she was convicted on 7 counts of first-degree murder and sentenced to death. But her date with execution never came. In 1972, the California Supreme Court temporarily abolished the death penalty in the case People v. Anderson. All death sentences, including those of the Manson family, were commuted to life imprisonment. Patricia Krenwinkel has now spent more than 50 years behind bars. She has been denied parole repeatedly, with panels citing her lack of full remorse and the sheer horror of her crimes. She's expressed regret, claimed she was under Manson's control, but for the families of the victims, the wounds never healed. She escaped the gas chamber, but not the cell. Patricia Krenwinkel is the longest-serving female inmate in California. Her name will never be separated from the blood-soaked madness of the Manson murders. And while her sentence was commuted, her punishment continues, year after year. Behind walls she'll likely never leave. In the summer of 1968, a Florida mother made national headlines, not for a protest, not for a tragedy, but for a murder so targeted, so deliberate, it seemed torn from a revenge novel. Her name was Marie Dean Arrington, and her motive wasn't money. It was vengeance. 2 years earlier, her son Lloyd had been convicted of armed robbery and sentenced to life in prison. His public defender, a man named Bob Pierce, had been assigned to the case. But Marie believed he hadn't fought hard enough, that he'd let her son down, and in her eyes, someone had to pay. But Pierce wasn't home when she came looking for him. Instead, she found his secretary, Vivian Ritter. What happened next was chilling. On April 22, 1968, Marie kidnapped Vivian at gunpoint from the law office. She drove her to a secluded area in rural Florida, forced her out of the car, and shot her in the head. Vivian's body was dumped like trash off a country road. She had nothing to do with her son's case. She was simply in the wrong place at the wrong time. When the body was discovered, the investigation moved quickly. Witnesses had seen Marie at the law office. Shell casings matched the gun registered in her name. Police obtained an arrest warrant and began the search, but Marie was gone. For months, she evaded capture, landing on the FBI's 10 most wanted list. She dyed her hair, used aliases, and drifted from state to state. But in August of 1969, her time ran out. She was arrested in New Orleans, hiding under a false name in a boarding house. Her trial was swift and unforgiving. Prosecutors laid out the premeditation, the kidnapping, the calculated brutality of the execution. She showed little emotion as the verdict was read. In 1970, Marie Dean Arrington was sentenced to death, one of the very few women on Florida's death row. But like many death row inmates of the era, her fate changed after Furman v. Georgia, the 1972 Supreme Court decision that effectively nullified existing death penalty sentences across the country. Her death sentence was commuted to life without parole. She would never see freedom again. Marie served more than 40 years behind bars, mostly at Lowell Correctional Institution. In interviews, she rarely spoke about her crime. She showed no remorse for what she did to Vivian Ritter. And in 2014, she died in prison at the age of 80, having escaped the electric chair, but never the consequences of her rage. Her story remains one of the few where motive, method, and outcome were all tied to a single word: revenge. 7. Susan Atkins. She was once a quiet, church-going girl from Northern California. But by 1969, Susan Atkins had become one of the most feared women in America, a loyal follower of Charles Manson, and a key figure in one of the most infamous killing sprees of the 20th century. Her name would be forever tied to bloodshed, madness, and the ritualistic murders that sent shockwaves through an entire nation. Susan first met Charles Manson in 1967. She was 19, adrift, and hungry for meaning. What she found in Manson was more than a leader. It was a godlike figure who promised revolution and family. He gave her a new name, Sadie Mae Glutz, and in return, she gave him her mind, her body, and eventually, her conscience. On the night of August 8, 1969, Susan Atkins entered the Los Angeles home of actress Sharon Tate. Inside were 5 people. Atkins helped tie them up, stabbed some of them herself, and according to testimony, whispered to Sharon Tate that she had no mercy, even as the pregnant actress begged for the life of her unborn child. After the slaughter, she used Tate's blood to write the word pig on the front door. At first, police had no suspects. But the case cracked open when Atkins, while in jail on unrelated charges, bragged to cellmates about her role in the killings. Her confession led investigators straight to the Manson family. She was arrested in October 1969 and charged with multiple counts of murder. Her trial, alongside Manson and fellow cult members Patricia Krenwinkel and Leslie Van Houten, became a national spectacle. Atkins smiled in court, sang Manson's songs, and carved an X into her forehead. Her courtroom testimony was so detailed and cold that jurors wept. In 1971, she was convicted of 8 counts of first-degree murder. The court sentenced her to death. But before the sentence could be carried out, the California Supreme Court abolished the death penalty in 1972. Her sentence, along with those of the other Manson killers, was commuted to life in prison. Atkins spent the rest of her life behind bars. In her later years, she claimed to have found God, expressing remorse for her crimes. She became a born-again Christian, married twice while incarcerated, and even published a book. But none of it changed the outcome. Every parole request was denied. Public outrage remained high. The families of her victims never forgot. In 2008, Susan Atkins was diagnosed with terminal brain cancer. She had one leg amputated, was bedridden, and had less than 6 months to live. Her final request was for compassionate release. The board denied it. Susan Atkins died on September 24, 2009, at the age of 61, after serving 38 years in prison. She escaped the gas chamber, but she never escaped the cage. They were sentenced to die, some by hanging, some by gas, and some by lethal injection. But one by one, their executions were called off. Their names crossed off the death calendars, their fates rewritten not with freedom, but with permanence. They escaped the gurney, but they never escaped the prison walls. From England's last female poisoners to America's most infamous cult killers, each woman in this story faced the ultimate punishment and survived it. Not because they were found innocent, not because their crimes were misunderstood, but because the system changed, the laws shifted, or society decided death was too much, or not enough. For some, like Sarah Lloyd, the reprieve came quietly, a single stroke of the Home Secretary's pen. For others, like Dorothy Williams and Marie Dean Arrington, it came as part of sweeping decisions to commute death sentences across entire states. And for women like Susan Atkins and Patricia Krenwinkel, it was a court ruling that spared them, even as their names remained etched in infamy. But mercy didn't mean release. These women spent their final years, or are still spending them, in concrete cells with no keys. Some died alone, some begged for parole that never came. Others found religion, wrote books, reinvented themselves behind bars. But the public never forgot. The families never forgave. This is the gray zone between execution and freedom. A place where time becomes the punishment, where each sunrise is another reminder, not of survival, but of judgment delayed. We often ask whether justice is better served by death or by life. Is the gallows more final, or is the lifetime of silence more profound? These women escaped the rope, the chair, the poison, but they never escaped consequence. Their lives became the slow burn of justice, a sentence not just written, but lived, every single day. They are proof that sometimes a commuted sentence is not a second chance. It's just a slower ending. Don't forget to like it, share it with others, and subscribe to the channel. Every week, we bring you stories that reveal the darkest truths of human nature and the justice that follows.